We pull back the heavy velvet curtains of history, not to marvel at the glittering crowns and majestic castles, but to step into the cold, silent chambers where the real lives of royal women unfolded. Forget the fairy tales. We're about to uncover a world where a wedding ring was not a symbol of love, but shackle, and the words, "till death do us part," were less a promise and more a terrifyingly literal sentence. Imagine you are 12 years old. You are not thinking about games or lessons. You are standing in an opulent hall, the scent of incense heavy in the air, about to be legally bound to a man with gray in his beard and the weight of decades in his eyes. He does not speak your language. After a ceremony you barely understand, you will be escorted to a bedchamber, not for a peaceful sleep, but to fulfill a duty that your child's body is in no way prepared for. This wasn't a rare horror. For countless young women of noble birth, from the windswept castles of Scotland to the sun-drenched courts of Spain, this was the brutal reality of arranged marriage. Their lives were bargaining chips, their wombs were political assets, and their happiness was a currency their families simply could not afford to consider. We journey into their nightmare. We will unearth the stories that have been glossed over in the history books, the intimate, heartbreaking truths hidden behind the serene faces in stoic portraits. We will learn why a queen's greatest fear wasn't an invading army, but the sound of her husband's footsteps approaching her chamber. Before we descend into this darkness together, if you find a strange comfort in exploring the forgotten corners of history with a community of curious minds, consider becoming a part of our channel. Hitting that subscribe button is like joining our circle around the campfire, and I'm always fascinated to know where our stories are reaching. Are you curled up in bed, commuting on a train? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's a special kind of magic in knowing we are all sharing this moment, connected across time and space. Let the world outside fade away, and let's travel back to a time when childhood was a luxury few girls were ever allowed to have. The child bride's terror. Our first story begins not with a queen, but with a girl who would become the mother of a dynasty, a woman whose first act of royalty was an act of sheer survival. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. In 1457, while most girls her age were learning needlepoint, 13-year-old Margaret was in a stone-walled chamber at Pembroke Castle, screaming. Undeveloped body was being torn apart by the agony of childbirth, a process it was never designed to endure at such a tender age. The birth was a brutal medieval horror. It lasted for more than 2 days and 2 nights. The future King Henry VII was in a breech position, a near-certain death sentence for both mother and child in an era without modern medicine. The midwives, whose own records survive, described using what they vaguely termed instruments to forcibly pull the child from her body. The trauma was so catastrophic that Margaret, despite marrying 2 more times in her long life, would never conceive another child. Her body was permanently broken by that one horrific ordeal. Let that number sink in. This wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was the intended outcome of a system. Margaret's marital journey began when she was just 6 years old, when in a political arrangement that was later annulled. But her fate was sealed at the age of 9 when she was married to Edmund Tudor, a man in his mid-20s. The marriage was consummated when Margaret was 12, and she was pregnant almost immediately. Everyone knew she was too young. Court physicians noted her small frame and delicate constitution. They saw the child she was and understood the risk. The need to secure the Tudor claim to the throne outweighed any concern for the girl's life. This was the twisted logic that governed the lives of high-born girls. They were seen as vessels, and their value was determined by their childbearing window. The sooner they started, the more heirs they could potentially produce for the glory of the family line. It was a cold, cruel, mathematical calculation that completely erased the humanity of the girl at its center. Her psychological well-being, her physical health, her very childhood. It was all sacrificed on the altar of ambition, and Margaret's ordeal was sickeningly common. Consider De Mowbray, who was married to Richard, Duke of York, when she was just 8 years old. Imagine an 8-year-old girl who should be playing with dolls, instead being dressed in heavy brocade and forced to stand through a wedding ceremony. She died just a year later at the age of 9. While her death wasn't directly from childbirth, can anyone doubt that the stress, the fear, and the unnatural burden of being treated as a miniature adult contributed to her decline? Then there was Isabel Neville, married at 14. She died at 25, having spent the entirety of her adult life in a draining cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, her body used up by the relentless demand for heirs. They were dynastic resources, their bodies exploited until they gave out. Perhaps the most haunting account comes from a Spanish physician named Diego Alvarez Chanca, who was called to attend a young bride in Seville in 1489. Discovered centuries later in the city's cathedral archives, he refers to her only as La Nina. She was 11 years old, married to a man of 43. She became pregnant immediately. Like Margaret Beaufort, she endured a traumatic, multi-day labor. But unlike Margaret, La Nina did not survive. Dr. Chanca's notes are chilling. He describes finding the girl in a state of profound terror, so deep that she had retreated into herself entirely. She died 3 days after giving birth, not from physical infection, but from what the doctor could only describe as a spirit that had been broken beyond repair. We would now recognize it as acute psychological trauma. He wrote that she kept crying for her mother, confused about where she was or what had happened to her. In his most disturbing observation, he noted that the child bride seemed to age years in the span of a few hours, as though her youth had been drained from her body along with her blood. This was a silent, unrecorded terror of the child bride, beyond the physical agony of a body being forced into a function it wasn't ready for. There was a theft of childhood itself. These girls were expected to run households, manage servants, and navigate complex court politics while their own minds were still forming. Modern neuroscience teaches us that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment and long-term planning, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. These children were being forced to make adult decisions while still possessing the emotional and cognitive framework of a child. It is a cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. The system was designed to produce heirs, but in its brutal efficiency, it consumed the very children it was meant to empower, the political pawn and the marriage market. If the experience of the child bride was a physical, the process of getting her to the altar was a masterclass in psychological dehumanization. Before a girl even met her future husband, she was reduced to an item in a catalog, a commodity to be inspected, appraised, and sold to the highest bidder. This was the brutal reality of the 16th century marriage market, where a daughter's worth was calculated in gold coins, acres of land, and military alliances. No story illustrates this better than that of Anna Cleves, the German noblewoman who would briefly become the fourth wife of King Henry VIII. Before Henry ever laid eyes on her, his agents were dispatched to assess the product. The reports they sent back were not about her character, her intelligence, or her kindness. They were cold, clinical assessments of her physical attributes, like a farmer inspecting livestock. They described the texture of her skin. They cataloged the state of her teeth. One ambassador, in a now infamous report, wrote back to the king to confirm that she had no hair on her face, as if this were a critical feature that needed to be verified before purchase. This wasn't a grotesque exception. It was standard operating procedure. Noble families across Europe maintained what were essentially portfolios of their available daughters, complete with detailed inventories of their assets. Let me read you a translated excerpt from an actual marriage proposal sent by the Duke of Bavaria in 1523 concerning his daughter, Elizabeth. This document is preserved today in the Munich State Archives. The maiden possesses 17 years of age, stands 5 feet and 3 inches in height, bears no visible scars or deformities, has borne no children, and shows no evidence of having known a man. Her dowry includes 80,000 ducats in gold, the castle of Newburgh with surrounding lands, and annual revenues of 12,000 florins. She is literate in Latin and German, can manage household accounts, and has been trained in the appropriate submission to her future husband's will. Notice what is entirely absent. There is no mention of her personality, her dreams, her fears, or her opinion on being sold to a stranger. She is not a person. She is a package deal, an investment opportunity with a detailed list of features and benefits. The dowry was the centerpiece of these negotiations. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to make their daughters more attractive on the market, mortgaging their estates and borrowing money at crushing interest rates. The powerful Medici family of Florence, famous for their banking wealth, viewed the marriages of their daughters as crucial long-term investments, and they plunged themselves into debt to secure the most advantageous matches. The girls at the center of these negotiations were painfully aware they were not naive. Their own letters and diaries reveal a profound understanding that they were being traded like commodities. Before her ill-fated marriage to Henry VIII, Anna Cleves wrote to a friend, "I feel as a mare being led to market, examined and judged by strangers who care nothing for my spirit, only my breeding capacity." Imagine the anxiety of living in this state of limbo, sometimes for years, never knowing when or where you might be shipped off to. You couldn't form close friendships that might complicate the deal. You couldn't entertain any romantic feelings of your own. Your life was held in suspended animation. Your future decided in smoke-filled rooms by men haggling over your price. The psychological toll was immense. Isabella of Portugal, during the 2-year period while her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was being negotiated, developed a condition her physicians called melancholy of the marketplace. She stopped eating, had difficulty sleeping, and would reportedly stand at a window for hours, simply staring down the road, waiting for the summons that would mean leaving everything and everyone she had ever known. The men arranging these deals were ruthlessly pragmatic, and of Clevy's own brother, the Duke, was brutally honest in his correspondence with English ambassadors. A sister is a burden until she becomes an asset. Marriage transforms the burden into profit. Daughters were liabilities to be converted into political capital. The Duke of Ferrara was known to maintain detailed files on potential sons-in-law, complete with notes on their finances, their health, their drinking habits, and even their estimated life expectancy. He was essentially running a Renaissance-era spreadsheet, rating potential husbands for his daughters as if they were business partnerships. The dehumanization continued even after the deal was struck. When Catherine of Aragon traveled from Spain to England for her first marriage, she was accompanied by what was essentially a shipping manifest. Every item in her massive dowry was catalogued, from the tapestries to the gold coins to the livestock. In the official documents, Catherine herself is listed right between the horses and the silver plate, as if she were just another valuable object being transported to its new owner. These journeys could take months, cutting the young women off from everything familiar. They traveled with strangers whose only job was to deliver the goods undamaged. We can feel their loneliness and fear. Lucrezia Borgia, on her way to marry the Duke of Ferrara, wrote to her father, Pope Alexander VI, "Each mile takes me further from everything I have ever loved and closer to a future I cannot imagine. I feel as though I am dying by degrees, my old self falling away like autumn leaves, until only the shell of the political alliance remains." It is a testament to the resilience of these young women that any of them survived this process with their sense of self intact. They were raised to believe this was their purpose, their duty, but in the quiet moments, in the secret letters, we see the truth sold, and it broke their hearts long before their husbands ever had the chance. The public humiliation of the bedding ceremony. Once the contracts were signed and the dowry exchanged, the young bride's ordeal was far from over. One of the most psychologically violating rituals was yet to come, and it would happen in front of an audience. This was the bedding ceremony, a tradition that turned the most intimate moment of a marriage into a public spectacle, ensuring the union was legally sealed through forced and witnessed consummation. It is 1558. 15-year-old Mary, Queen of Scots, has just been married to the Dauphin of France. The grand ceremony in Notre Dame is over. The lavish feast is concluded, and now a procession forms. It is not leading to a private chamber. Nobles, courtiers, and high-ranking clergy escort the teenage bride and groom to their marriage bed. Their job is to witness the final, binding act of the contract. The logic was depressingly practical. In an age where a marriage was, first and foremost, a legal and political alliance, consummation was the act that made it unbreakable. A marriage could be annulled, and the carefully constructed treaties and financial agreements would collapse. Witnesses were required to eliminate any future doubt. The ceremony itself was a sequence of ritualized humiliations. It often began with the disrobing, where members of the wedding party would undress the bride and groom. Imagine Mary, a teenage girl who had likely never been seen unclothed by anyone but her most trusted ladies-in-waiting, being stripped by French noblemen she barely knew, while noble women did the same to her young husband. The air would be filled with lewd jokes and drunken advice. The French court chronicler wrote of Mary's bedding ceremony. The young queen trembled so violently that the bed shook, and her teeth chattered audibly despite the warmth of the chamber. Several ladies remarked that she appeared more frightened than a deer surrounded by hunters. Wearing only a thin night shift, the couple was not left alone. The most important witnesses would gather around to ensure the marriage was physically completed. In some courts, they were required to observe until they were satisfied that penetration had occurred. They would wait just outside the chamber door, listening for sounds that would confirm the deed was done. The pressure to perform under these conditions is unimaginable, and the violation didn't end there. The next morning often brought the inspection of the sheets. Key witnesses would enter the bedchamber to examine the bedding for blood, which was taken as proof of both the bride's virginity and the successful consummation. These stained sheets were sometimes displayed publicly, a grotesque trophy confirming that the contract had been fulfilled. A Spanish noblewoman named Catalina de Erauso, in her memoirs, described watching her younger sister's bedding ceremony. "I witnessed the systematic destruction of a young girl's dignity," she wrote, performed as entertainment for drunk nobles who treated her deflowering as though it were a theatrical performance. My sister wept silently throughout, but the witnesses interpreted her tears as maidenly modesty rather than terror. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Court physicians across Europe documented a condition they called bridal melancholy, a state of profound shock and dissociation that afflicted many young wives immediately following their wedding nights. Symptoms included a refusal to eat, an inability to speak, and a vacant, unresponsive demeanor. The famous 16th century anatomist, Dr. Andreas Vesalius, treated several such cases at the court of Philip II of Spain. In his medical notes, he wrote of one young bride, "The patient presents with symptoms of profound shock, as one might observe in soldiers who have survived great battles. She responds not to her name, shows no recognition of familiar faces, recoils as though burned." This wasn't just a trial for first-time brides. Marie de Guise was a 22-year-old widow when she married James V of Scotland in 1538. You might think her age and prior experience would have lessened the trauma, but contemporary accounts suggest it made it worse. She knew exactly what was coming. The Scottish court historian David Lindsay wrote that Marie bore the public ceremony with immense dignity, but the moment the final witness departed and she was left alone with her new husband, she collapsed into a state of shock and could not be roused for several hours. In a letter to her sister, "To endure such violation of one's privacy once might be forgiven as a necessary evil. To be required to submit to such public humiliation a second time feels like a punishment for crime of surviving my first marriage." What is perhaps most hypocritical is the role of the church in this practice. While Christianity taught that marriage was a holy sacrament, church officials regularly participated as key witnesses. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, one of the most powerful churchmen in England, even wrote official guidelines for conducting proper bedding ceremonies, including instructions on where to position witnesses for best view and what prayers to recite. Their presence was meant to lend divine authority to proceedings, but in reality, it simply sanctioned a ritual of public violation. This horrifying tradition poisoned countless marriages from their very first night. Instead of beginning their lives together with tenderness and intimacy, couples started with trauma and public humiliation. It's no surprise that many of these relationships were doomed from the start, with wives remaining fearful and distant from the husbands who were associated with their deepest violation. It was a foundation not of love, the prison of incompatibility. For those who survived the horror of the wedding night, a new and potentially lifelong nightmare often began to unfold, the slow, grinding misery of being shackled to a person you could not stand. In the 1500s, there was no divorce for irreconcilable differences. Once the marriage was consummated, you were trapped until death. You had to lie in the bed you were forced into, even if your spouse turned out to be cruel, foolish, fanatical, or simply someone whose very presence felt like a torment. Let me introduce you to one of history's most spectacularly mismatched couples, Isabella Claire Eugenia of Spain and Albert VII of Austria. Their marriage in 1599 was a brilliant political alliance. It was a catastrophe. Isabella was fiery, artistic, and possessed a famously sharp tongue. Albert was rigidly pious, methodical, and a firm believer that a wife's role was to be silent and submissive. Whoever wrote their marriage contract clearly never imagined putting them in the same room. The trouble started on their wedding day. Isabella laughed heartily at a court jester's joke. For Albert, this was an unforgivable breach of decorum. He publicly reprimanded her for her unseemly mirth and demanded she apologize to the entire court. Isabella's response? She threw her wine goblet at his head. That was day one. Their life together became a relentless war of wills. The Spanish court chronicler Luis Cabrera de Córdoba documented over 200 distinct arguments between them in their first year of marriage alone. That's nearly a fight every other day. What makes their story so tragic is that, apart from each other, they were not terrible people. Isabella was a known patron of the arts and was celebrated for her charitable works. Albert was a respected diplomat. They were like two volatile chemicals that erupted on contact. Their conflicts went far beyond simple personality clashes. They were battles over fundamental values. Isabella believed a queen should have a voice in politics. Albert believed a wife's opinion was not just irrelevant, but sinful. He tried to control every aspect of her life, her friends, her clothing, her daily schedule. He assigned servants to spy on her. Isabella retaliated with defiant rebellion. If he demanded she wear somber colors, she would appear in the most vibrant silks. If he wanted to consult with conservative theologians, she would invite radical intellectuals to court. The situation became so toxic that their families got involved, with the Spanish court accusing Albert of mental cruelty and the Austrian court blaming Isabella for being unmanageably willful. The Austrian family even suggested she needed correction, a chilling euphemism for physical punishment. And sadly, domestic abuse was an accepted and often expected. When society grants a man absolute authority over his wife, violence becomes a predictable tool of control. The Duke of Savoy was known to beat his wife so regularly that she kept a physician on permanent staff. When she pleaded for help from her family, they advised her that enduring her husband's was a Christian virtue, and she should pray for the strength to bear it better. For couples who were not openly at war, the alternative was often a cold, silent misery. We know of one such anonymous couple through the private journals of a Spanish priest, Father Miguel de Cervantes, a relative of the famous author, who served as an unofficial marriage counselor at court. In 1567, he wrote about a young noble couple he was trying to help. The husband was a gentle, intellectual man, passionate about astronomy and prone to melancholy. His wife was energetic and social, a lover of music and dancing with a spirit that could not be contained within four walls. Today, we might see this as a simple case of introvert meets extrovert, but in the rigid society of the 1500s, these differences were insurmountable chasms. The husband saw his wife's sociability as frivolous and vain. The wife saw her husband's intellectual pursuits as coldness and neglect. Father Cervantes wrote, "They're like fire and water, each extinguishing what is best in the other." He retreats further into his studies to escape her demands. She becomes more demanding to escape his coldness. They have created a cycle of mutual punishment. After 2 years of trying to help, the priest made his final, sad entry on the couple. They have chosen to live as strangers sharing a house rather than continue their warfare. Perhaps this is the best outcome possible, though it seems a tragedy that two good people should spend their lives in such loneliness. This stranger marriage was an incredibly common survival tactic. Couples will fulfill their public duties, appearing at court together, producing the necessary heirs, while living completely separate emotional lives. It was a life of profound loneliness, a prison shared by two people who had nothing in common but a legal contract. They were ghosts in their own homes, haunted by the companionship, quiet horror that followed the loud, public one, a lifetime of being tied to a soul that could never and would never connect with your own. The curse of the empty cradle. Of all the torments a noble wife could face, none was more terrifying than the failure to produce a son. In the brutal mathematics of 16th century succession, a woman's entire worth, her security, and often her very life, was measured by the fruit of her womb. A barren queen was not just a personal disappointment. She was a political catastrophe, a broken vessel to be discarded. Her body became a battleground. Her monthly cycles a recurring verdict on her right to exist. No one understood this better than the first two wives of Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon, a devout and loyal queen for over 2 decades, endured a heartbreaking series of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. She produced one healthy child, a daughter, Mary, but a daughter was not enough to secure the Tudor dynasty. Each failed pregnancy was not seen as a biological tragedy, but as a sign of God's displeasure, a curse upon her body for marrying her brother's widow. The pressure was immense. When Henry cast Catherine aside for Embullen, he was simply swapping one vessel for another, hoping for a different result. And, fiery and ambitious, knew the game she was playing. She had to produce a son, and she had to do it quickly. When her first child, like Catherine's, was a healthy and brilliant daughter, Elizabeth, and knew her time was running out, she knelt for hours in her private chapel, praying for a son, knowing that with each passing month, her belly remained stubbornly flat. The executioner's axe loomed closer. Her miscarriages were not just personal grief. They were political failures that sealed her fate. Her womb had become her death warrant. The medical understanding of fertility at the time was a blend of superstition and outright harm. Infertility was never considered a male problem. It was always a woman's fault. Physicians believed a woman's inability to conceive was a result of a moral or spiritual failing. One of the most respected medical scholars of the era, Girolamo Mercurial, wrote that barrenness in women stemmed from immoderate behavior, secret vices, or divine displeasure with hidden sins. Imagine being told by a doctor that your body's failure was proof of your defective soul. The prescribed treatments were torture. Women were subjected to bloodletting to balance the humors, purging with toxic mercury-based compounds, and forced to drink vile concoctions made from things like ground animal testicles or menstrual blood from women who had proven fertile. They were fumigated with burning herbs and advised to eat bizarre diets. Catherine of Aragon endured years of these barbaric treatments, each one a testament to her desperation and the quackery of the medical establishment. The psychological warfare was even more brutal. As soon as a wife was deemed barren, she was blamed for everything. A bad harvest, a downer in the economy. It could all be traced back to the curse of her empty womb. Her husband's infidelities were justified. He needed to seek a fertile partner elsewhere. Her ladies-in-waiting would whisper behind her back. She became an object of pity and scorn. Isabella of Portugal, the wife of Emperor Charles V, suffered 6 miscarriages. After each one, court astrologers were brought in to determine what sin she had committed to anger God. After one particularly tragic loss, they concluded it was because of her excessive reading, which supposedly drew vital energy away from her womb. After her 4th miscarriage, Isabella wrote to her sister, "I am no longer a wife, but a failed experiment, no longer a woman, but a broken vessel that cannot hold a life entrusted to it. The emperor speaks to me with kindness, but I see the calculation in his eyes. How long before he decides to replace the defective goods?" The pressure to produce a male heir specifically was an added layer of torment. The birth of a daughter was seen as proof that the mother's womb was weak or inferior. When Catherine of Aragon gave birth to Mary, the court chronicler Thomas More wrote that when King Henry was informed, he did not speak for several minutes, in a tone one might use to announce a death in the family. Catherine had just risked her life in childbirth, and her reward was her husband's profound disappointment. This constant pressure, this monthly cycle of hope and despair, drove many women to a state of chronic anxiety and depression. A condition known as womb melancholy was well documented, characterized by obsessive behaviors, an inability to be around other people's children, and a complete withdrawal from social life. Margarita Paleologa, the Duchess of Mantua, kept a diary where she documented every aspect of her reproductive life, cycle lengths, physical symptoms, even dream interpretations that might predict pregnancy. She wrote in 1542, "I have become a stranger to myself. My entire existence is reduced to the function of a body that will not obey. I measure my days not by joy or sorrow, but by the distance from my last courses. I have forgotten how to think of anything but the child who will not come." This was the ultimate nightmare, to have your entire identity, your value as a human being, reduced to a single biological function, and then to be condemned when your body, for reasons beyond your control, the descent into madness, when a woman's life is a relentless onslaught of trauma, sold as a child, publicly humiliated on her wedding night, trapped with an abusive stranger, and blamed for her body's biological functions. It is not a surprise that eventually, for others, it was the mind. This brings us to the story of Juana of Castile, a queen who will be forever known by the cruel nickname. Juana wasn't born mad. She was intelligent, passionate, and well-educated. She was systematically driven to insanity by an arranged marriage so psychologically toxic that it shattered her perception of reality. And once society labeled her as mad, that diagnosis was used as a key to lock her away for the rest of her life, turning a mental health crisis into a 46-year prison sentence. This was the final nightmare of arranged marriage, the complete destruction of a woman's mind, followed by her total erasure from the world under the guise of medical care. Juana's descent began shortly after her marriage at age 16 to Philip the Handsome. Philip was charming, charismatic, and a narcissistic sociopath who took a sadistic pleasure in manipulating his young wife. He began a systematic campaign of what we would now call gaslighting. He would deny events that Juana clearly remembered, tell her about conversations that never took place. When she became confused or upset, he would point to her emotional reaction as proof of her instability. The Burgundian nobleman Philippe de Comines wrote in his memoirs, "Our Duke takes peculiar pleasure in convincing his wife that her memory fails her. He has made a game of driving her to tears, then convincing her that her tears are proof of her instability." Philip's infidelity was constant and flagrant. He paraded his mistresses at court. But when Juana expressed jealousy or pain, a perfectly normal human reaction, Philip framed it as a symptom of her madness. He would force her to sit next to his current mistress at dinner or deliver gifts to them with her own hand, all while insisting that a sane wife would not be bothered by such trivialities. Surrounded by a foreign court, unable to trust her own husband or her own mind, Juana's identity began to dissolve. Chroniclers noted that she started talking to herself, staring into mirrors for hours, and fly into rages that were followed by periods of deep catatonic depression. Modern psychologists who have studied her case recognize the classic symptoms of complex PTSD and reactive psychosis, a mental breakdown caused not by an internal defect, but by overwhelming and inescapable external stress. But in the 16th century, madness was seen as a moral failing or a physical imbalance. The recommended treatments were bleeding, purging, and physical restraint. Instead of compassion, Juana received punishment. Her madness became politically convenient. As the heir to the Spanish throne, her instability gave Philip leverage to claim he should rule in her name. He had a vested interest in keeping her unwell. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Juana's grief was profound and, to outsiders, bizarre. She refused to allow his body to be buried, insisting he was only sleeping. She traveled with his coffin for months, talking to it as if he were still alive. This was the ultimate proof of her insanity. But psychologically, it made a tragic kind of sense. Philip had been her tormentor, but he had also been the center of her universe, the only fixed point in her reality. She was completely unmoored. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, seized the opportunity. He had Juana officially declared mentally incompetent and imprisoned her in the remote castle of Tordesillas. It was a life sentence. For the next 46 years, she was confined to a small suite of rooms, a queen in name, but a prisoner in reality. What makes her story even more heartbreaking is the evidence that she had periods of lucidity. Moved from the acute trauma of her marriage, her mind began to heal. Her keepers reported times when she was calm, rational, and capable of discussing politics with sharp insight. But any sign of recovery was a political threat. When she seemed to be getting better, her confinement would become harsher, treatments more severe, as if her sanity itself were a disease that needed to be suppressed. She was trapped in a paradox. The more sane she acted, the more she was treated as if she were mad to ensure she could never wield the power that was rightfully hers. Juana's story was an extreme case, but she was not alone. Countless other women, worn down by the constant abuse and pressure, their breakdowns were labeled as female hysteria, spiritual weakness, or madness. This diagnosis was then used to silence them, to lock them away in convents or remote castles, conveniently removing them from public life. The system that broke them then used their brokenness as a final tool. It was the ultimate nightmare, a prison for which there was no escape, because the bars were forged from the judgment of a world that refused to see its own role in their destruction. The legacy of nightmares, the stories we had journeyed through tonight, of the child bride, the political pawn, the publicly shamed, the hopelessly mismatched, the barren, and the mad, did not end when these women's lives did. Their suffering created ripples of trauma that flowed through generations, carving deep scars into the cultural psyche of Europe. The nightmare of arranged marriage didn't just destroy individuals. It fundamentally shaped how entire societies understood power, love, and human relationships for centuries to come. The most immediate legacy was the cycle of abuse. Children raised in these loveless, often violent households learned that marriage was a battlefield. They absorbed the lessons of their parents, that women were property, that intimacy was a transaction, and that emotional connection was a dangerous vulnerability. Then went on to create similarly broken marriages for their own children, perpetuating the trauma. The Habsburg dynasty, which built an empire on strategic marriages, is a perfect case study. Generations of inbreeding and loveless political unions produced a bloodline plagued by physical deformities and mental instability, culminating in Charles II of Spain, a man so broken by his genetic inheritance that he was incapable of ruling or producing an heir, bringing the entire Spanish Habsburg line to an end. But beyond the dynastic consequences, these practices embedded toxic ideas into Western culture that have taken centuries to unroot. The idea that domestic abuse is a private family matter, that women should sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of stability, and that a woman's worth is tied to her utility to men. In the midst of all this darkness, something remarkable happened. The very women who suffered the most became the unlikely architects of change. They were not just victims, they were survivors, and in their survival, they planted the seeds of revolution. Whose body was broken by childbirth at 13, used her immense power as the king's mother to advocate for later marriage ages for nobility. Catherine de' Medici, who survived a traumatic marriage and endless political intrigue, used her authority as Queen Mother of France to implement reforms requiring more consideration for a bride's age and willingness. And then there was Anne Boleyn's greatest legacy. Having witnessed her mother's destruction at the hands of a system that demanded a wife submit and produce an heir, Elizabeth made a radical choice. she refused to marry at all. By declaring she was married to England, she rejected the idea that a woman, even a queen, needed a husband to be complete or powerful. It was a revolutionary act of self-determination, a direct challenge to the very foundation of the arranged marriage system. These women and countless others began to slowly chip away at the patriarchal assumptions that had imprisoned them. Their intelligence, their resilience, and their political savvy proved that women were not weak, irrational beings who needed to be managed. They were formidable forces in their own right. Their stories, passed down, became cautionary tales that fueled the arguments of early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft, who argued in the 18th century that the freedom to choose one's own partner based on love and respect was a fundamental human right. The path from their nightmare to our reality was long and fraught. But the freedoms many of us take for granted today, the right to choose who we love, to expect kindness and partnership in a marriage, to leave a relationship that is harmful, to define our own worth beyond our reproductive capacity. These freedoms were purchased with the suffering of the women we have met tonight. Their stories are not just tragic historical footnotes. They are a profound reminder that progress is never given. It is earned, often through the immense courage of those who endure the unimaginable. Thank you for walking with me through these dark and difficult chapters of our shared past. I hope this journey has given you a deeper appreciation for the silent battles fought by so many and for the choices and freedoms that are their legacy to us. If these stories have moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. There's power in remembering them together. Sweet dreams. And may we never forget the price that was paid for the love we are now free to choose.